Hi, this is Steve Wagner, and I'm here to talk to you about employee selection today. And as you know, employee selection is the process by which an organization chooses which applicants to employ. And we try and introduce a systematic process to employee selection so that we can hire the best people that will increase the organization's productivity and save the organization money. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we introduce methods which I'm going to refer to as selection tests. Now, you may think of a test as like an exam in school, but I'm using the term test very broadly. So everything from the application blank to the paper and pencil test to the interview to the work sample, anything that's contributing to our decision about who to hire is a selection test. So what makes a selection test useful? That's one of the key questions here, and we're going to look at a number of different characteristics, but the first characteristic that we must consider is reliability. What is the consistency of the information that we get from that selection test, that instrument? We can look at various forms of reliability or stability. The most basic is test-retest. Is a person's score stable over time? If we were going to give the test to a person 6 months apart, would their scores remain fairly stable, or would they change dramatically over time? We also look at internal consistency. So if a test has multiple items, if an interview has multiple questions in it, what is the stability across those items in the selection test? We can look at inter-rater reliability. What is the stability of different observers? So different people observing the same interview, or if we put a candidate through a role-playing exercise and have different people observing it, do those people agree with one another? Is there stability in their observations? We can also look at parallel forms. Is there stability across different versions of a selection test? So, for instance, we may have different versions that are supposed to be equivalent to each other, because what if someone applies 1 year and comes back the next year to apply again? We may not want to give them the same test, but we'd like to give them an equivalent test, a parallel form of that test. Consistency or reliability is important, but perhaps more important is accuracy. And when I say accuracy, I'm talking about the validity of the selection test. And that goes to the question, are we measuring in this selection test what we're trying to measure, what it's supposed to measure? And we need a test to be reliable in order to be accurate. Okay, so reliability is a necessary condition for validity. But just because a test is reliable doesn't make it accurate. You can be consistently incorrect, inaccurate. Let's look at an example here. Okay, here is our Acme intelligence test that we might want to give out to try and hire people for our organization, and it consists of 5 questions, and they're simple true-false questions. You can look at them yourself and say, okay, how would I respond to this? And your responses would probably be pretty consistent, pretty stable. Am I smart? Yeah, true. I'm really smart. True. And I was smart yesterday. True. And I'll be smart tomorrow. True. And I'm not stupid. True. Very consistent in how I respond to this test. But is it an accurate test? Okay. Well, it may measure intelligence to some degree, in that it measures whether a person is literate in the English language, but it may not really be a very accurate measure of what we need to hire in terms of intelligence. And so here we have a reliable test, but a test that's questionable in terms of its validity. How do we gauge the validity of a test? One way is we look at the content validity, the extent to which the test represents what you're trying to measure. Typically what we're trying to measure is how well a person would perform on the job. Here we see the connection with job analysis. And so we have to understand the job and what performance on the job means in order to gauge whether the content of the test is accurate for that job. And typically what we do is we have a panel of experts in that job look at the test, understanding job analysis information, and gauge, is this an accurate test in terms of its content. Now this is different than the concept of face validity. Face validity is the extent to which a test appears to measure what it should be measuring. And so from the perspective of a non-expert, perhaps an applicant, when they look at this selection procedure that we're presenting to them, do they feel like it measures what a person would be doing on the job? And so some tests, some selection tools have a high degree of face validity. So if we're doing a work sample for an appliance repair person and we say, here is a washing machine that's broken and we want you to diagnose it and fix it, that appears like what a person would do on a job. On the other hand, if we have a personality test, it may not look to that applicant anything like or sound anything like what they're doing on the job. And so it's good to have face validity. It's not always necessary, but there's a risk to not having face validity. Applicants who are not hired may feel that they've been treated unfairly, that they've been given a selection tool that is not a valid instrument, and it might cause them to pursue legal remedies to that feeling of being treated unfairly. Another way we can gauge validity is criterion-related validity. And so this is when we actually measure test scores and measure performance on the job or some other criterion like turnover or customer satisfaction, and we correlate test scores with that criterion. And we look and see, is there a significant correlation between scores on the selection test and the criterion, which is some job-related performance measure. Now we can do this in a predictive fashion where we actually take applicants and we give them the selection test and then later measure their performance on the job. If you're doing this in a scientific study, the problem is that you really shouldn't be using the test to hire people, because you will be having a restricted range and diminishing the value of your validity coefficient or your correlation coefficient. So oftentimes what we do instead is you do a concurrent validity study where we take present employees, give them the selection test, and measure their job performance and see whether there is a significant correlation there, giving us empirical evidence that the test is related to job performance. This is very strong evidence of the validity of a test, and if there are concerns about litigation, criterion-related validity is some of our strongest evidence for the validity of a test. Beyond looking at reliability and validity, we should look at the utility of the test. So how much money is that test worth to the organization? There's certain costs associated with the administration of a test. Okay, so even a job interview, it takes time that we're paying wages for and we're paying benefits for of our employees. And so all of that time that it takes, and maybe if we're flying people in for those interviews, that's a cost associated with it. And we assume that we're deriving some benefit from those interviews, that it's resulting in a higher quality employee that will make and save the organization money. So utility is all about looking at that. What is the cost benefit of using a selection tool? One thing that we can see here is that there's a number of factors that go into whether there is a financial benefit to a selection tool. One is its criterion-related validity. Does it actually predict performance on the job? We can also look at the selection ratio. How many applicants were there and how many people did we want to hire out of that? The higher the selection ratio, the more applicants we have versus positions that we're hiring, the more utility we're going to get out of a test because we can be more selective. As we talked about, there are testing costs. We also have to look at the relative worth of a good versus poor performer on a job. So the relative worth of good versus poor performance is another thing that we need to consider, and this is measured by something we call the standard deviation of Y, okay, which is basically the difference between someone who's a good performer and a poor performer in terms of the money being made for the organization. And this really depends on the job that we're hiring for. So if we're hiring for a custodian, there is some financial value to a good versus poor performer. However, it may not be as much as the financial difference between a good versus poor salesperson whose value might be in the millions of dollars. We also have to look at how long we expect a worker to be with the company. The longer that they remain with the company, the more utility or financial benefit that we get out of the test. So we can do utility analysis. We can actually do a mathematical procedure combining all of this information. And one expert in HR named Wayne Cassio has done quite a bit of work here. I recommend his book quite highly. It looks at utility analysis. One final factor, of course, that we always have to think about in any kind of personnel decision, but especially in terms of selection, is there adverse impact? Is there some bias? And so, is the test fair to all different applicant groups, whether they're a member of the majority group or a member of a minority group? So we have to look at adverse impact. Is the rate at which we hire people from the majority group higher than the rate that we hire people from the minority groups? And we have to realize that tests that are valid can result in adverse impact. Now, we still, if it's a valid test, we can use that, but there's a consideration for what kind of organization do we want to have? Do we value diversity? And are we selecting on things that we can develop people in? And those are multiple considerations that we need to make in human resources. So adverse impact is one of the things we should be looking at to decide whether a selection test is useful, in addition to utility, validity, and reliability. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.